Let's bring in Sky News host James Morrow and James McPherson. James, very strong words from Netanyahu. They wasn't taking a backward step in terms of his criticism of Albanese and other leaders like him, of their failure to have any moral clarity or conviction since October 7.
Yeah, and I was listening to that with great interest, Sherry, and I think he was absolutely right about what he said about the Prime Minister, the lack of moral clarity that we've had ever since, October 7th. I'm not sure that he went far enough, because I think really what he's missed, or I'm sure he understands but didn't want to articulate there, is that the course that Prime Minister Albanese has taken with regard to Israel is something that he has had in his head literally for decades. He was a convener of Parliamentary Friends of Palestine. He was a sharehouse socialist, at the university. This sort of pro-Palestine, anti-American, anti-Israel stuff, he would have been steeped in this and grown up in it. And one of the really interesting things here, one of the interesting threads that I think the Prime Minister of Israel spoke about really quite articulately, is that this is not just about Israel. And this is why this is so important, of course. Yeah. It's about Western civilization. And, this is why I think this is also critical, because what you see when you see these demonstrations for Palestine against Israel, there's a whole big thread of Australian illegitimacy, too, that runs through them. And Australia, to a large part of the activist, as a large part of the activist community believes, and there's a whole long kind of leftist philosophical way that you can sort of talk about this here, but both Australia and Israel are both equally illegitimate settler colonial states. And this is, this is the cancer within the West that right now I think is eating away at us. It is not just that it is an external threat like Iran sponsoring Hamas or whatever, these sorts of groups, Hezbollah, the Houthis. It is an internal intellectual virus that we have, that gets caught up in a toxic empathy, and it winds up creating these circumstances where you're not just protesting against Israel and for Palestine, you're also protesting against the very liberal democracy that we are enjoying and that allow people to go out and act like this.
James, what I really think is quite admirable about Netanyahu is that right from the moment that October 7 happened, on the same day, you saw from the Australian government, from Foreign Minister Penny Wong, calls for restraint. I mean, the terrorist was still at the kibbutzes and she was calling for restraint. So he's been dealing with this hostility from the international community, including from Australia. He's been incredibly restrained. These allegations that he's interfered in our domestic politics. He didn't come out before the federal election. I wish he would have. He didn't. Yeah. It's only that it's come up now, nearly 2 years on.
What struck me about that interview, Sherry, was just the steely determination of Benjamin Netanyahu. He talked about how previously the Jews have been taken advantage of, they have been slaughtered. He said, not today. They believe their enemies when they speak, as opposed to Anthony Albanese, who continually talks about the need to isolate. Anthony Albanese's words, let's isolate Hamas. You don't isolate evil, you destroy it. At the beginning of your interview, Benjamin Netanyahu referred to Hamas as monsters, and he reminded us, as he must continually do, how this began on October 7, beheading people, burning babies. We don't like to hear it because it's horrible, but that's the reality. And we've got a Prime Minister in Australia who likes to deal with fantasy. Well, we'll talk to Hamas, we'll isolate them, we'll get some sort of a deal. Israel can't afford to deal with fantasy. They are dealing with reality. And I was really struck by the determination from Netanyahu and almost he wants a good relationship with Australia, but not at the expense of his country. He can't afford that. And so he's not going to be put off by the moral high horse of people like Penny Wong or Anthony Albanese, who can take pot shots from a long way away. You've been to Israel, James, you have, I have. It's a very small country. Netanyahu can't afford their luxury beliefs. And he's right to call out the cowardice of the Australian leadership.
He also laboured the comparison between World War II, also the Munich Agreement, or Munich Betrayal as it's known, that he referred to 1938, when Europe ceded Czechoslovakian land to Hitler. As he says, that didn't appease Hitler. You can't appease dark forces or terrorists. But this comparison to World War II, even on the civilian death toll, was really fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you can argue about Israel's conduct in Gaza in specific instances, but I think overall you have to say that, the way that they have conducted themselves has been trying to minimize, the mayhem and the civilian chaos. But one of the things, too, that there's actually a couple of important points. Number one of the things that I always say, people say, look, there's starving babies here in Gaza, there's this, there's that atrocity, and so on and so forth, the food and so on. Well, people need to stop and think and ask, logically, who benefits from photos of people starving in Gaza? It's not Israel, it's Hamas. Hamas has a very, very sophisticated propaganda war being run for it with allies out of Iran, also out of Qatar, who have spent decades building up a propaganda apparatus in the West, including at universities, including in the media. That's the first thing. The second thing, too, though, we talk about World War II, and, to a certain extent, I think sometimes people get a little bit carried away using World War II as the only frame of kind of any historical sort of thing. So I always say, also, let's look at, what the other situation we've got playing out right now in the world right now, which is Ukraine. Well, how many people do you have? I would love to see a Venn diagram, if I could do the Kamala Harris thing here. I'd love to see a Venn diagram of people who say, well, Ukraine must not cede a single inch of territory to Vladimir Putin. And the number of those who say, but, Israel, come on, let's go back to some previous borders. Let's go there. They cede this, concede to Hamas, and so on. And, this fight here in Israel is really the one that is about Western civilization, I think, more than any other conflict going on in the West. And when you look at the World War II example, again, if you want to talk about it, the Allied air campaign against Japan, the Allied air campaign against Nazi Germany created mass civilian casualties because the object was to break Imperial Japan and to break Nazi Germany's will. And Israel hasn't gone anywhere near that far.
I think there would be ABC viewers and readers of the Sydney Morning Herald and other, Nine products that would have no idea that Israel, as Netanyahu said tonight, literally sends out millions of text messages and phone calls asking people to get out of harm's way before it takes any action, that its conduct is above and beyond any other military in the world. They wouldn't know that. This Hamas propaganda is so all-pervasive, and it is spread by the Albanese government as well.
As Benjamin Netanyahu said, no other military force has ever done what the Israelis have done. Text messages, 1 ton of food per person in Gaza. All of this just goes over the heads of the critics of Israel. And if they're trying to commit genocide, it's the least successful genocide in the history of genocides. If they wanted to commit genocide, they could have done it in a day with overwhelming military power.
He says
they
in
have
an afternoon.
In an afternoon, of course.
Yeah.
So the charge is ridiculous. Everybody knows it to be ridiculous. And the fact that Israel are not only dealing with that, but he pointed out they're fighting this war on 7 fronts. You've got to remember, it's not just Hamas. It's Iran through all of their proxies, whether it's the Houthis, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Islamists in Syria. So Israel have got a lot going on right now, and you've got to give them enormous credit for the way they've conducted it. Instead, all they get is demonisation.
And interesting that he actually talks about that as another war. He says we're dealing with the military war and the propaganda war.
Yeah.
And he believes eventually that Israel will win both. I think that's potentially optimistic, James, because we seem to have this entire generation of young people who have been firmly indoctrinated through social media, through a university setting, to think that Israel is the enemy and is committing war crimes.
Well, and in Australia, they're taught not only to think that Israel is the enemy, but that Australia is the enemy, and that Western civilization is the enemy. So, they're fighting a hot war in Israel. We're fighting an intellectual Cold War here in Australia and also, in some ways in the United States. Donald Trump has done an awful lot to reverse that, through a lot of very strong policies, going after universities and hotbeds of this sort of thing. And you're seeing all of the kind of the apparatus that pushed that stuff ending there. We don't have that sort of strength by any means here, and I wish we did. But that said, this is, again, it comes back to what he was saying. This is a fight about not just the survival of Israel, but Israel is demonized here, not just because it's Jewish and because of the sort of historical anti-Semitism. It's demonized because it's successful, right? In the Marxist construct of modern wokeism, to be successful, to be strong, to be powerful is to be automatically the villain and the aggressor. This probably started, I would say, at the conclusion of the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel had another multi-front war and smashed all of its enemies and suddenly became the powerful state. And, of course, a lot of that anti-Israel propaganda was then pushed by the Soviet Union through the left, and we're experiencing the hangover of that decades later today.
Just a couple of specific things. He also urged action against protesters there. There was a section of the interview where he referred to the pro-Palestinian protest movement in Sydney, Melbourne and other cities as well. And he seemed exasperated why leaders weren't standing up and calling it out and taking action against it. Also, he referred to Donald Trump's view of the decision by nations, including Australia, to recognise a Palestinian state. And he said that, Donald Trump's view is that those nations and what they're doing is irrelevant. And that is correct when it comes down to, well, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. But it was an interesting mindset to how, again, little Trump considers Australia. Yeah, well,
Australia, Anthony Albanese has admitted that it's not going to make a big difference on the ground, but it's a symbolic thing. You remember when October 7 happened and Antony Blinken went to Jerusalem and he talked about this is a moment for moral clarity. And there's two types, as you've been expressing, James. There's the moral clarity about the conflict in Gaza. There's also the moral clarity about what's happening on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne, what's been going on in this country, the sorts of chants that have been going forward, the sort of demonstrations that have been held. And on both counts, our government has failed. And Benjamin Netanyahu was very strong on the fact that Israel are not just fighting a war on behalf of Israel in the Middle East. They're fighting a war on behalf of Western civilization and the values that we hold dear. And for the government not to confront the anti-Semitism on our streets only encourages more, and they've failed dismally at that.
Well, the one thing that I find encouraging, though, is that there was that poll that Resolve did for the Herald that found that more people were against the recognition than for it. And, when it comes to these protests, again, remember, this is a government that is beholden to demographics in Western Sydney and in suburban Melbourne that are very anti-Israel.
Demographics and their own personal ideology.
Correct.
Which is why the charge of cowardice for Anthony Albanese rings true, because that's what it is. It's either fear of certain sections of the population or it's self-interest where you're trying to garner votes. It's as simple and as evil as that.
James McPherson, James Morrow, thank you both so much for your time and your analysis.